Hello and welcome to our first mini episode of Love Your Library, the Hampshire Libraries podcast. I'm Mary Stone and I'm delighted to introduce you to the talented writer Hanna Jameson. According to Amazon, Hanna wrote the first draft of her debut novel, Something You Are, when she was 17 years old. It was shortlisted for the CWA John Creasy Dagger Award in 2013. Since then, she's written several novels to high acclaim. Her latest novel is a post-apocalyptic thriller called The Last. It follows the story of an American academic trying to find out who murdered a girl in a Swiss hotel. It's set in the aftermath of a nuclear war that has destroyed most of the Western world. My co-host Kate Price McCarthy met up with Hanna to talk about her latest release. Here she is reading a section from the book.
Day 3. Nadia once told me that she was kept awake at night by the idea that she would read about the end of the world on a phone notification. It wasn't exactly Kennedy's Sword of Damocles speech, but I remember that moment word for word. For me, 3 days ago, it happened over a complimentary breakfast. Breaking, nuclear attack on Washington in progress, story developing. Breaking, 200,000 fatalities estimated, say experts. Breaking, confirmed, president and staff among dead in nuclear explosion, awaiting more information. Then there was some aerial footage from London, and we all watched the buildings vanish into dust in real time under an iconic pillar of cloud. That was the only footage available, so we watched it over and over. It didn't seem as real as the headlines. Maybe we had all been desensitised to the imagery by too many movies. Watching a whole city vaporise like that seemed too fast and too quiet. A plane went down on the outskirts of Berlin, and we only knew Berlin was gone because someone in the plane had uploaded a video of them going down. Dust in the engines, maybe. I can't remember what she was saying. She was crying and hadn't been speaking English. It was probably just goodbye. Breaking, nuclear weapon detonates over Washington, hundreds of thousands feared dead. Breaking, Canadian Prime Minister calls for calm as nuclear attack hits US. Breaking, US without government as nuclear bomb devastates Washington. Maybe I was lucky, watching the end of the world online instead of living it, reacting to an explosion or a siren announcing one. We're not gone yet. This is the third day and the internet is down. I've been sitting in my hotel room watching what I can see of the horizon from my window. If anything happens, I'll do my best to describe it. I can see for miles over the forest, so when it's our turn, I imagine I'll have some warning. And it's not like I have anyone to say goodbye to here. I can't believe I didn't reply to Nadia's text. I can't believe I thought I had time.
Thanks very much. And that's pretty much right at the start.
Yep, that's the first chapter. An abridged version.
Thank you, of The Last. And it's subtitled One Hotel, 20 Survivors. So could I kick off then by just getting you to give us what is the premise of this, well, the intriguing premise of this book?
The premise of the book is it's essentially a post-apocalyptic murder mystery. It's set in the months immediately following the outbreak of nuclear war, and it's narrated by a historian, an American historian, stranded in a hotel in Switzerland with 20 other survivors who are waiting for an evacuation which never comes. And the murder mystery element is that a few months into their long wait, they find a girl's body in one of the rooftop water tanks, and John becomes obsessed with the idea that a killer is in the hotel, and he begins on this misguided, or maybe not, investigation into what might have happened to her.
And it's the description of how people might react and what would happen to the world if this should happen is frighteningly realistic. And I'm intrigued to know how much time you spent researching this, imagining how yourself would react, I guess. How much time did you think about that before you started putting pen to paper?
Well, it's a subject that I think about a lot anyway. I read a book on sort of disaster psychology. I annoyingly can't remember its title, but it's something called like When the Worst Happens or Worst Case Scenario, something like that. And it's all about how people either react to things by freezing, fighting or fleeing. And I started this book in sort of the first month of 2017, so it was just after the US presidential election. And it was inspired quite heavily by the amount of nuclear war jokes that were happening sort of online. And, nuclear war was suddenly an anxiety that was permeating our culture again. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, between the sort of nuclear anxiety and the sort of looming existential threat of climate change, I tend to write what I'm scared of or what I'm pondering. And one thing I've wanted to explore recently is, how we react to the possible end of Western civilization or the end of humanity, sort of as we know it. So that's where The Last came from.
I'm intrigued because at one point, the narrator talks about how he will deal with it, maybe by writing it down.
Oh yeah, writing is definitely a form of therapy. It's how I channel any feeling of sort of despair, sadness or frustration, hopelessness. It all comes out in my writing. And I think especially there's a lot of these emotions to channel with regards to our political situation at the moment. And I remember reading a really interesting theory shortly after the election of Donald Trump in the US, where it felt like a grieving process that everyone was going through. Like, everyone was in such a state of shock because we'd become so used to the, maybe myth of an idea that we were progressing forwards, that society just naturally progresses. And then suddenly it seems like we're not progressing anymore. It suddenly seems like we're regressing quite sharply. And it does feel like a loss that people are having to get over. Like, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of bargaining. It's classic, grief behaviour, which is what I wanted to explore through these characters. Like, it's essentially about how different characters react to grief, but it's for their whole way of life. It's just gone.
Although, having said that, there are some readers who might shy away from books about post-apocalyptic worlds, and to some extent I was a bit trepidatious taking this on, but I would say that despite the death and destruction, I found the book to be kind of strangely uplifting.
Yeah.
Because there is purpose to be found and roles to play and how we would react. And perhaps because it is frighteningly realistic, I kind of began to say, maybe I would deal with it and maybe I would keep my values in such a circumstance.
Well, it's I always have said that the book is much more optimistic than me. I think it is quite hopeful. It's not just about, what evil would humans do to each other if given even more of a chance. It's about, all of our structures are gone, so what better structures could be built in its place? Which is why, The Last is a very bleak premise, but it's a book that's full of really human moments, and it's full of a lot of cooperation. And the forging of these new relationships and trust and all of these things. I think it's quite a hopeful I think it's got a hopeful message alongside a lot of big questions.
I was able to sleep. I love the theme of history and the fact that a protagonist is a historian, and he sees it not only the purpose of solving the mystery of or identifying the murderer, but also seeing it as his purpose is to record this history of what's happening. And for all he knows, they may be the only people, so it's important to record the history and recording people's stories. And I love the way that the American student,
Tommy?
Tommy. She teases him about how maybe in his account he's going to be really making sure he comes over as the good guy.
Yeah.
So this idea of the importance of history and the recording of history, is that something that you are consciously writing about? Is something that you're interested in?
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, I'm kind of a history student in my spare time anyway. I've spent most of my 20s studying, American history specifically. And historians are, not just compulsive record keepers, but they're also natural detectives. That's, quite literally part of their job. And one thing I've also found, trying to make sense of our political landscape now is that the historian's perspective is always the most valuable because they are usually not reactionary by trade. It's not their job to react to things, it's their job to interpret and to see this event in the scheme of a much larger story. John being a historian, as well as being, an American historian and being a guy and being a liberal academic, these were all deliberate decisions because he sees a very wide cast of characters through this particular lens and he has to work out how to make sense of them.
Yeah, I think I did find it fascinating, for example, the way the other survivors were starting to blame the Americans for what had happened. And I think there's something like 8 different nationalities of people who are at this hotel was so. Was that an intended diversity in order to explore these political issues?
It was only intentional in as much as it was realistic. Because I thought, it's a European hotel. What are the chances that they're all going to be, white British or white American? Like, there's going to be black characters, there's going to be children, there's going to be non-Europeans, there's going to be mixed race people. And I mean, that's important to me just from a realism perspective. I don't think it would be realistic if it was just a load of British people holed up talking to each other from that limited perspective.
The setting with this isolated hotel among the forest, clearly it's got all sorts of resonances with Agatha Christie and Grand Budapest Hotel and Bird Box. There were some things that I thought about, and also Stephen King, which you quote Stephen King in the book.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I got a sense that you enjoyed playing with those resonances and those echoes from other books.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, it's inevitable as a writer anyway. You end up paying homage to your favourite people. And yes, Stephen King was a massive influence, especially with the horror elements in the novel. And the fact that people start becoming obsessed with the idea that the hotel might be haunted, that they might be haunted. They start sort of questioning their sense of destiny. And I love playing with those questions because I think in that sort of crisis state, with the end of the world, I think people would start questioning, in a religious or spiritual sense. And I think it lends itself to horror really well. And I loved, the hotel as a setting is already inside a horror setting in the fact that they're so isolated and there's nothing around them but woodland and trees. So it's very claustrophobic and very isolating at the same time, which is, classic Shining, I guess.
That was my co-host, Kate Price McCarthy, talking to author Hanna Jameson about her latest book, The Last. Thanks for listening to Love Your Library, the Hampshire Libraries podcast. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more interviews like this, plus book recommendations from our expert library staff in our longer episodes. Get in touch and let us know what you think of the books and the authors we've talked about. And it would be great if you'd rate and review our podcast on iTunes, as this helps other people find us. You're listening to Love Your Library, the mini podcast, with me, Mary Stone.